Well, everyone, welcome. My name is Christina Singh, and I'm Head of Events at Stone & Shaw. Thank you so much for logging into our webinar on how to position your board advisors for success. Just a couple virtual housekeeping. We understand how important it is to answer all of your questions, so we ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Also, we will have a quick survey at the end, and we really appreciate if you could just complete that survey. It really helps us. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our amazing guest speaker, Julie Garland-McLaren. Julie has served on 17 boards over the past 16 years, specializing in organization and resources, engineering, utilities, infrastructure, and not-for-profit sectors, which are facing interesting challenges. Concurrent with board work, she helps boards and directors improve their effectiveness. Julie is also a public speaker on boardroom issues and in demand for courses, seminars, conferences, and just like today, online webinars. She has a very extensive experience as a director to engage, stimulate, and educate. As the author of 6 books and many training materials to company directors, she is an acknowledged expert on resolving a wide range of complex governance issues. Her newsletter, The Director's Dilemma, reaches readers in 33 countries. So if you would like to take a look, we will email you the link to her resources, and you may get a free copy at the end of the event. Now, over to Julie.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's just such a pleasure to be here. One of the things that I really love is helping people before they get into trouble so that they never get into trouble. And the joy that I get from my work is really helping directors to build companies that they can be proud of. So without further ado, I'm afraid I have a human slide advancer. So next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with George, he's the executive chairman of JUI, which is the largest, I'm told, the largest online property platform. And George hit a nerve with me when he said that CEOs typically pull every lever within reach to help their companies succeed, yet too many consider their board more of a challenge than a resource. And there's a very good reason for that. Next slide, please. Because boards are an unusual environment. Mark Twain once said, never wrestle with a pig in the mud because you'll both get dirty and the pig likes it like that. Now, I'm not suggesting that your boardrooms are like sties, but I would suggest that the ways of boards and the ways of governance are sufficiently different from the ways of management and the ways of entrepreneurialism that it's an environment which seems quite opaque for you when you first come into it. So one of the things that I would suggest is you really need to make sure that rather than being as clear as mud, next slide please, your boardroom environment is as clear as you can possibly get it. And there are a few things that I would suggest you can do that will help you to make it clear. And the first of those is to be really careful who gets into your boardroom. You really want to appoint directors who've got specific skills that are relevant at each stage of your company's growth. You want to manage the tension between shareholder representation and director contribution. You want to develop appropriate advisory boards, panels, and governance for your organization at each stage of your development. And you also want, I assume, to prepare your company either for listing or for a trade sale exit or for some other measure of success that you will define in a way that's unique to you. So we'll talk a little bit about how you might go to transitioning from whatever you've got now to what you want then. And then the final thing is you really need to make sure that everyone who gets into your boardroom knows exactly what to expect and what you expect from them. So setting those expectations, making sure that they understand tenure, remuneration, behaviors, culture, all of those things which can lead you astray if you're not careful. Next, 2 slides, please. I've had a wonderful presentation introduction, so I won't go through this slide. I'll move straight on to the next. Really important, if you bring someone into your boardroom, make sure that you have checked that they know how to be a director. And this is particularly important if you're bringing on somebody who's got specific technical skills, for example, cybersecurity or digital commerce, or someone who's got great experience opening doors and building commercial relationships all around the world, but hasn't actually worked as a non-executive. Never assume that somebody knows how to be a director, because it's not something that we are born with an innate knowledge of, and it's not something that's frequently taught in business schools. You'll often find that you can go through an entire MBA and in fact an entire DBA without doing anything about boards and boardroom protocols and environments unless you specifically have an interest and navigate towards that. Next slide, please. So here's the quick crash course, the 1 minute, this is how corporate governance is supposed to be. And the idea is that we'll start at the top and follow the money, shall we? Shareholders provide the capital. Because they're the ones who pay the piper, they're the ones who get to choose the tune. So they get to elect the board, and it's only the shareholders who can appoint and remove directors. As a founder or as a senior executive team or as an advisory board, you might have a very strong influence, but it is the shareholders' vote at the end of the day that decides who gets to be sitting around that boardroom table as a director. Once you're at that table as a director, your job is to represent the interests of all of the shareholders and to govern the company to make sure that it prospers and fulfills its potential. Now that sounds really easy, but if you are a nominee director or if you are a shareholder director, sometimes it's very hard to separate your own personal interests from the needs of the company. And yet that's what you've absolutely got to do. Got a couple of questions coming in, but I can't read them, so I will just check if they are relevant. I will get Christina to shout them out, and if not, we'll hope that I address them and I'll pick them all up at the end. I promise I will finish nice and early so we've got time for them. Within the board, you might have a managing director. This is a director who sits on the board and has a vote with the other directors, but has also got the task of running the company that's been delegated to them. Or you might have a CEO who doesn't sit on the board or have a vote, but reports to the board. In a startup and entrepreneurial companies, you'll usually find that this person is a shareholder. So again, you have that inbuilt tension there between shareholder interests, company interests, and at this point, executive interests. You have management who again, may or may not be shareholders, may or may not be substantial shareholders, and you have staff who serve customers. So quite a hierarchical, in theory, structure, but that is what is considered to be the gold standard pretty much everywhere around the world for how you should organize a mature, stable company's board. So let's move on and have a think about the sorts of people you might want in the room. Next slide, please. When we're looking at our directors, it's really important. I would suggest that when you're appointing directors, the things you want to consider are, firstly, do these people have experience on the board of a company at a similar stage of development to the one I'm appointing them to? Very, very important. Company development stage is one of the most impactful things on how your board will operate and how it makes good sense for your board to operate. The second thing to look for is recent experience of the sector or the industry or the technology that your company is dealing with. And ideally, also the ability to solve one of the problems that your company is facing, at least one. You want somebody who understands your capital structure and your sources of capital, whether you're VC funded, whether you're institutional funded, whether you're funded by high net worth individuals, or whether you're funded by the staff and management, whether you're bootstrapping. People who've got an innate understanding of how it feels to operate in that environment. And you also want people who can build the trust in the relationships you have with staff, with customers, with joint venture partners, with regulators, with all of the people you deal with. And somebody who brings something that no one else on that board brings. This is very important. And then the fundamental layer is somebody who understands the role of the board and the directors. You are not hands-on managers. You are not technically, individually in control of any one piece. You are working as a team in an environment of joint and several liability to deliver governance in a cohesive and coherent way. Next slide, please. Now, sometimes you see a lot of articles on LinkedIn and various other places talking about who you must have on your board. Sometimes it's easier to turn around and say, well, look, let's just set a few guidelines here about who we don't want on our board. And really important, you do not want in your boardroom making your board decisions anyone who's a pea in a pod with another director. So really watch out for people who are all members of the same socioeconomic demographic, who all went to similar universities at a similar time, who all live in similar postcodes and drive similar imported cars and possibly play golf with each other at the weekend. They're not going to bring the diversity of perspective and insight that you need for a growing company, and particularly if your customer base is not from those postcodes and from that socioeconomic demographic. So really important to think through making sure that you've got not just the experience, not just the gravitas, but also those other insights that come from different perspectives. Really important thing as well is don't let anyone in your boardroom if they can't make a decision. And it's not just people who are naturally dithery and indecisive. It's also people who've been nominated by people that have not given them the authority to do the role that they've been nominated for. It is the absolute kiss of death for a fast-growing, rapidly adapting company to have a director at the table who says to every single proposal, oh, that's really interesting, let me take it back to the shareholder and ask. Now, it is really important. Shareholders do not vote in board meetings. Shareholders vote in shareholder meetings. There's a difference. If you have the vast majority of your shareholders represented in your meeting, one of the things I did on one of my early boards, we had a gentleman on the board who owned 90% of the equity. He was the founder, it was his company. He was looking to divest and to grow and to be diluted down and do exciting and interesting things. But every so often he would say, oh, I want to do this. Why are we discussing? I want to do this. And we'd say, okay, if you want to do that, what we're going to do is we'll adjourn the board meeting. We will convene a shareholder meeting. The shareholders, because 100% of them were present in the room at every board meeting, will waive their right to notice. And then we will put it to the vote. And because you've got 90% of the equity, you will win. And then we will close the board meeting. And then as a board, we will act on the shareholders' instructions. But you are not going to make the rest of us responsible for your decision if it's one that we're uncomfortable with. And you need to have that toughness and that independence and that ability to say either I can decide this, or if I can't decide this, this is the way that we will handle it so that it gets done quickly. Really important, you do not want people in the board who are going to act on their own interests. And you will see people who say, oh, look, I'd kind of like a dividend, or I'd like an exit now because I need my money back. Very typical for VC funds. They have a time horizon and they want their money back at the end of it. The fact that it might be better for you to keep going for another 12 or 13 months and then have a bigger payday is really quite irrelevant to them. So if they are directors on a governing board, they really have to learn to balance what they want as a shareholder with what the company needs as a growing, developing company. So very important. Conflicts of interest are one of the main things that ASIC and other regulators around the world will look at when they're deciding whether or not a board has been malfeasant, which is another long word for badly behaved. Really important as well, don't have friends and family on your board unless you're absolutely convinced that they've got the guts to tell you something you don't want to hear because they know you need to know it. I'll say that again. Don't have anyone who doesn't have the guts to tell you something you don't want to hear if you need to know it. Too many organizations. Really classic example would be Napoleon Perdis. What a brilliant cosmetics company. I adored them. I adored him. I still do. Don't tell my husband. But his board was entirely made up of family members. It was great at the beginning when they all supported each other and it was a small company, but they needed so much more skill and they needed somebody who could stand up to him. And the final thing is, you cannot abdicate your decision-making to algorithms, robots, AIs, companies, or any other sort of synthetic person. There was a company in Hong Kong which announced to the stock exchange that they'd appointed an AI to their board. They got into terrible trouble because, of course, legally you can't do that. You have to have a real person that can be really grabbed and physically placed in a real prison if they do the wrong thing. It's kind of hard to do that with an AI. Pulling the plug or hitting the off switch just doesn't cut it. So very important. If you are relying on these tools, it is still the board's decision. It is not the tool's decision. So you need people in your boardroom who understand how those tools are developed and how those tools are manipulating data in order to be able to make the recommendations that they are making. And the decision is always yours. No matter what they recommend, it's your decision. Make sense? Next slide, please. So I talked a bit earlier about the cycle of adaptive growth. Really important to think through when you're looking at the directors, who has been on a board at a similar stage. And one of the things that you will notice is that some directors really do stick to certain types of company and certain environments. And for you guys, I guess the most exciting and important one is that rapid growth, highly developmental, highly transformative stage that characterizes a lot of startups. And this would be the stage that, for example, Steve Jobs was in during his first term with Apple, when he really ramped it up and grew it. And as he reached the end of that term, his skills were suddenly no longer what Apple needed at that time. The company was moving from growth to stabilization and conservation. And that was not his mindset or his skill set. The same thing happened with Microsoft. Microsoft, rather than getting rid of the founder, moved the founder from being CEO to being CTO, and then moved him back after a time when he had developed the ability to be successful in the new environment. So really important, think through. And one of the questions that came up when you booked in earlier was, at what point do you need to realize that governance is important? And I would say right at the beginning. The moment you make a commitment to someone else, you need to make a commitment to govern your organization to deliver. Some people say it's when you bring in your first outside equity. I'd say it's when you make your first promise to someone. It's a good idea to do what you say you will do. The other thing is, at each stage of growth, you'll notice if you read governance literature as I do, that it talks about matters that are reserved for the board. Your constitution will set out matters that are reserved for the shareholders. Some of them you can change, some of them you can't. They're legal necessities. And matters that are delegated to management. In a company that's growing rapidly, the balance between those matters is radically different, next slide please, to the balance between those matters when you have a company that is in a more stable and conservation-oriented stage. So this is where your company is now mature, you might be listed, you might have been acquired and become part of a larger whole, but at some stage the growth has to taper off. At some stage, systems and stability and refocusing start to play a part in your decision making. At this point, the balance of power in the boardroom has to change. It has to move to another place where management now might be making far more of the strategic decisions. You might have a much larger and more skilled and more broadly focused management team. The board might be much more in a compliance and monitoring role. So working out who is doing what at each stage. And the really important thing that you'll be doing at this stage is thinking about how much cash are we generating? How much of that cash are we throwing off in the form of dividends? How much of that cash are we reinvesting in growing our existing business? And how much of that cash are we harvesting and holding for investing in new businesses, which is another form of release, but that stays within the company's control rather than the dividends which don't. So these are really important decisions which are quite different to the decisions the board is making in the early growth stage. And if you want a good example of a company that's navigating, in my opinion, through this stage at the moment, have a look at WiseTech. The changes that they are now making to the way in which they are addressing their sales, the way in which they are addressing their markets, and the way in which they're starting to think about capital allocation. I would say they seem to be a company that's making that transition from growth to conservation in a very considered and successful way. And it's always so much easier to copy someone who's doing it right than it is to watch someone do it wrong and work out a better way of doing things. So copy the good guys. That's a piece of cheap advice. Next slide, please. Of course, at some stage, you're going to have to change your operations. Nothing lasts forever. Even Wrigley's spearmint gum keep changing what they do and how they do it. So thinking about, am I in a turnaround situation? Has my stabilization and conservation led me dangerously close to stagnation? And this is the point at which Apple went and got Steve Jobs back. They'd gone too far in the conservation direction, not far enough in the growth direction, and they needed that different focus and that different mindset. Recognizing this before you kill the company is really important. And again, you need that courage in the boardroom of directors who will tell you that you're doing the wrong thing. Final slide, or final slide of this cycle of adaptive change is, of course, once you've reorganized, once you've rejigged, then you swing back into growth. And I'll use an example from my distant past for you. If you look at BHP, very successful silver, lead, and zinc miner. Then started throwing off cash, invested in a new business and reorganized to become a multiple miner with iron ore and coal. Then invested in becoming a steel maker as well as a multiple miner. Then invested in becoming a really diversified resources and steel making conglomerate. And is now, if we trust what we read in the papers, which I think I might, thinking of moving away from, well, it's already moved away from steel making, but now thinking of moving away from the coal and the carbon intensive materials into being a different sort of resources play. So there's no such thing as a stable, mature, immutable company. and you need different people at every time and at every stage of your growth. I hope that rings true, and I hope that makes you think very carefully about the sorts of directors and the sorts of challenges in your strategic plan and the need to build a match between the two. Next slide, please. And yeah, just a little cautionary tale. If you get it wrong, it's pretty costly. This is unfortunately American data, which is probably slightly different to the Australian data, but Entrepreneur Weekly put out this chart, and they reckoned that less than 15% of companies survived for more than 10 years. Next slide, please. 25% of CEOs who are still leading and in charge. So if you want to be a Mark Zuckerberg, a Rupert Murdoch, or one of these entrepreneurs who stays with their company, you really need to make sure that you have the right board around you and that you yourself transform. And you also need to make sure that you remain in control of board composition. And the best way to do that is to remain in control of the equity and having a sufficient stake, so don't get too diluted too early. Now, I'm not going to talk about capital and finance structures. That's not my expertise, but I'm sure you understand that having a solid grasp of your share register is really important if you want to have a firm grasp on the CEO role. Next slide, please. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about the difference between shareholders and directors, and it is really important to understand that these are two different roles. A lot of startups conflate those two, and in my opinion, that's a really bad mistake. Shareholders are investing for returns. You have caused them to do that by giving them a view of your plan. They have a rightful expectation that that plan is going to be implemented and it's going to deliver more or less in line with what you promised. And they want regular information to reassure them that that is indeed what's happening. Directors may have a lot of different reasons for joining a board. It may be because they support the company. It may be because they just have a genuine interest in the sector. It may be because they've got a particular skill, for example, mergers and acquisitions, international legal contract management, that they want to provide to your board. They'll have a range of reasons. Understanding why are you joining my board at this time and at this point in your career is really important if you're going to successfully manage that person throughout their tenure on your board and successfully manage their transition off your board. You know, too many companies talk about succession planning. That's like 10 in the bed and the little one said roll over and one fell out. It's kind of uncomfortable. Whereas if you talk about progression planning and you say, look, you're joining my board and this is where you are in your career, this is where my company is in its development. This is how far we think we're going to go together. At the end of that, I want my company to be like this. What do you want your career and your director profile to be like? And how can we help you to make the connections and to build the profile that's going to leave you at the end of the time we're planning to spend together, able to move on happily to newer and bigger challenges? It's a completely different sort of conversation to the, okay, your 3 times 3 years is over, you're out. You really, that's not a nice conversation to have. But directors are liable for what the company does. So they want input to the plans. They have the right to monitor implementation of those plans. And they also have the right to any information that they reasonably believe they need in order to make the board's decisions. And this is something that has gone time and again right the way up to the High Court and always been upheld. They have to use the information for a proper purpose, but they have an absolute right to it if they believe they need it to make their decisions. which is kind of scary for you as a CEO or as a management team member. Next slide, please. So really important to think through, what are the expectations that people have of me, and how am I going to manage those as I go forwards? Obviously, your constitution should answer a lot of those questions from prospective shareholders and prospective directors. But you want to add to that. Make sure that you have something like a code of conduct. Make sure that you have been really explicit about what will it take for you to earn equity as a grant or as a set of options. What will it take for you to be allowed to invest? What are the terms? What are the conditions? What is the timing of the opening and closing of investment windows? What do we expect you to do for us? Do we expect you to use your contacts and go out and create networks for us? Do we expect you to support our sales efforts and to really open doors for us? Do we expect you to perhaps give us access to in-kind trades? And you'll see this quite often when people come on as shareholders in technology companies. You can use our platform and we will use your data, and together we will build a business that makes sense for both of us. Really important to document these ones quite carefully, because otherwise you start falling into that conflict of interest. So being clear up front, very, very useful. You need to talk as well about remuneration and incentives. And there were a couple of questions that came up as people registered about how much should you pay directors? And the answer is you have to pay them what you need to get the ones that you think you need. So a good director isn't going to come cheap, but for a startup, they'll probably be willing to work for equity. They might well be willing to invest as well and buy some equity, as well as gaining some equity for their investment in time and effort. Yeah, the scale from people who are perhaps working in your organization as a senior executive and not paid any extra for their board contribution, to people who are totally independent and therefore wish to be paid because they don't have equity, because they want to chair your audit committee or some such thing. So really think through this particular director at this particular time. What is it going to take to get them on board? Be very clear as well about the time and the skill that you expect people to invest in their board role. Think about the need for directors to understand how to operate in a boardroom environment, how to manage the confidentiality, how to manage the collegiality, how to manage the fact that they're responsible for everything, not just the bit that's in their particular technical area of expertise. And also, really important, as you bring someone on, have that honest conversation about tenure and let them know when you expect to be moving them off. It's really quite important. You can give equity to advisors, you can give equity to directors, you can give equity to managers. You want to be very strategic about this, and I can't give you too much information about that because it will depend on your unique circumstances. Next slide, please. Really important, once you've had those conversations and you've reached that decision about, yes, we have enough areas of overlap in what we want and what we're prepared to give, that it's worth making an appointment, write it all down. Even if you are a very small, very early stage, it does not have to be a legalistic document. Dot points will do at this point in time, as long as it's very clear what the expectations are. And even if they're not enforceable because a board does not respond to management instruction, it makes very clear what the expectations were at the outset. And that has a subtle effect on the behavior as you then continue through the tenure of the director or the advisor. Next slide, please. Now, you don't need necessarily to have these people on your board. your board shouldn't be too large. There's nothing worse than a tiny company with a huge board. It's just totally out of proportion. So think about things. If you have managed to get that nirvana of an engaged and technically skilled, diverse, independent governing board, and your shareholders are saying, well, hang on, we want representation, we want more frequent information, we want more detailed information, there's nothing that stops you from creating, for example, a shareholder council where the major shareholders can interact in depth with management, can see plans, can ask questions, can make recommendations, can give advice, but they're not making board decisions. There's nothing wrong with having an advisory board, particularly if your board or your governing board is dominated by shareholders, and you really need to get that technical and business advice rather than that careful monitoring of investment performance that you're more likely to get from a shareholder dominated board. You might decide that you don't actually need an advisory board. What you'd really like is just a panel of advisors. And the difference between a board and a panel is that with a panel, you go to each individual for their particular skills. With a board, the individuals come together and they all contribute their skills and perspectives and insights to the decisions you're making. And the other thing that I'd encourage most founders to think about is their CEO peer group. Having a group of like-minded CEOs, for example, the people you're likely to meet around Stone and Chalk, is really helpful when you're going through this for the first or maybe even the second and third time. And so think about different structures. And remember, the corporate governance standards are not a legal requirement. They are more like guidelines than they are like a prescription. So you don't have to take them that logically. But it is important, and especially important with an advisory board, that you really watch your terms of reference. Next slide, please. You probably all heard the saying that if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If your advisory board is doing all the things a governing board would do, the Corporations Act in Australia will recognize everyone on it as a company director. Even if they've joined your advisory board and not your governing board because they wanted to avoid liability. You cannot act as a director without being liable as a director. And this is something that a lot of major shareholders and a lot of advisory board members trifle with at their own risk. But another word for a shadow director is an uninsured director, and you do not want to be one of them. So really important, if you have an advisory board, have a terms of reference that sets out what is this board giving advice on. And don't let it, for example, if it's giving market advice and development advice, also talk about monitoring and auditing your accounts and signing off on reports before they get lodged, because you're straying dangerously into director territory. Does that make sense for you? I really hope it does. And next slide, please. When you've got it right for long enough that you are ready to start thinking about an IPO, the first thing I'd say is you really want to have started thinking about this already. Ideally, you want to be thinking about getting yourself ready for your IPO about at least a year before it is planned to happen. And you need to think about, well, what is the executive team that I want to have with this company, with a track record with this company, that I can put in the prospectus and the investors will go, wow, that's what we want, fabulous. What is the strong governing board that I need? Now, there's a little bit of debate about this. You do see companies successfully going to IPO and they've got a board of directors nominated who will take up their positions when the company floats. Now, if that is your case, it's a very good idea to bring those people on to an advisory board so that you can demonstrate to prospective investors that your board is actually aware of what is going on in the company and isn't going to suddenly be caught flat-footed The last thing you want is, for example, something like the Dick Smith debacle of getting listed and then having a very rapid transit through the listed board and into liquidation. You need to have a risk register and plans. You need to have technical expert reports. You need to have evidence for every single statement that you're going to make in your prospectus. And I would suggest start drafting that prospectus early, keep updating it, and build a huge, horrible file where for every sentence, there is another column next to it that says, what is the source of the evidence for this sentence? And make sure that not too many of those entries say management assertion or founder's advice, because they will be red rags to lawyers, they will be red rags to all sorts of people. Make sure when you're drawing your projections that you've included enough capital to cover the costs of the IPO, and be careful because IPOs are generally more expensive than you expect them to be. Make sure that you have policies, particularly things like a share trading policy. And as you're writing that policy, it's a very good idea to take the chance to tidy up your register now so that people who do not wish to be escrowed aren't escrowed, and so that your shareholder base looks appropriate for the sort of company you're going to be when you hit that IPO. So really think about tidying up the register and getting those policies. Think about your disclosure policies and training all of your staff in what they can and cannot say, as well as when they can and cannot trade in shares. Because again, never assume that people understand the listing rules. Review and renew if you need to every single contract. Check that you really do have title to all of your assets and that you can lay hold of it when the directors are asked to provide it as you go through your due diligence. Choose the right market. There are some companies that have gone straight to NASDAQ and it made brilliant sense. I mean, look at Atlassian, what a success story. And there are some companies that went to NASDAQ and really they shouldn't have bothered. So make sure that you have thought about what is the right market for my company and why is that the right market? And how am I going to approach that market if it's not my home market? And make sure that you've really got a plan for your IPO that is as good as your plan for the company. Copy similar companies that have made a good job of it and really pick the absolute right time to go. Make sure that you don't go when the market's dead or that you don't go when your money's pretty much run out and you absolutely have to, because otherwise you'll be talking to an administrator. That's not an attractive investment proposition. That's not the way you want to start your life as a listed company. So really important. There's a lot of work to be done before an IPO. And probably at this stage, this is where you really want to be thinking through about getting hold of some experienced directors who've been through the IPO process themselves and can give that experience and advice to your board. Next slide, please. Now, if you're the person who asked the question about the NFP board, I'm really sorry because there wasn't really time to go through NFP governance, not-for-profit governance examples. Obviously, it is quite different. Usually you would not pay your directors, but it is perfectly legal to pay them. There are a lot of differences. I'm happy to have a quick conversation with you if you want to phone me afterwards. And I hope you're not feeling, because you've just been sitting here waiting for me to get to the not-for-profit bit and you've suddenly realized it's not happening. I hope everybody else is feeling suitably relaxed, having had some of the questions they wanted answered. Next slide, please. And I really wish I could be meeting you in person in some way, shape or form, but unfortunately it was not considered safe to do so given the current pandemic. So what I will do is go through the questions that you've entered into the chat box now and see if I can answer some of them. Next slide, please. I've also given you my contact details so that if you want to, you can send me an email or give me a phone call. I will be happy. Just mention the words stone and chalk and I'll give you a quick free bit of advice. Okay, what was the first question, Christina?
Should you limit director shareholding to an ESS or purchase only?
Ah, yes, an employee share scheme or purchase only. You can try. You can certainly try to make them pay for their shares. You can certainly try to have them access those shares on the same terms that other employees do. I think it's a good idea to allow the board to participate, but you may want, for example, directors coming onto your board to have a larger piece of equity. Some directors will say, look, grant me 2 years worth of director fees in equity up front, and I will join. And this satisfies, for example, the Australian Shareholders Association that likes to see directors owning at least a year's worth of director fees in equity. So I think an ESS is a very good idea, but it's not the only idea. And you might want, for example, to allow directors in appropriate windows to buy shares on market, or to buy shares when you're raising capital during other capital raising rounds as you go through. Next question.
Amazing. Someone wants clarity. Please elaborate on the correct meaning of independence when referred to independent director.
Okay, yes, a technical governance question. An independent director is one that does not have any significant shareholding. And by significant, this means anything that's big enough to sway their judgment, which flies straight into the face of all of those people who say you want directors to have skin in the game. Because if there's enough skin in the game to change their diligence and their decisions, there's enough skin in the game to render them non-independent and in fact give them a significant conflict of interest. So to be independent, no significant shareholding, no significant trading relationship as a customer or supplier, must not be an employee, and must not be a family member of anybody in those 3 groups, and finally must not have been within those 4 groups in the last 2 to 3 years. So independence is actually quite a high bar, and particularly when things go dramatically wrong, it is one of the things that the ASX and other regulators will look at. And the ASX does recommend that a majority of the directors should be independent. Before you are listed, it is quite common for there to be far more non-independent directors because of the nature of your organization and the fact that these people will very often be motivated by the capital gains that they can get through an investment in your company at an early stage. I hope that answers the question.
Another one is, if I give them equity, aren't they adverse tax issues?
Yes. Unfortunately, the Australian regime is not good for grants of equity or options. And they are taxed in a way that really makes it quite difficult. The people receiving them often have to pay tax on them before they've vested or before they've got the money or the gain that they were hoping to get. It's a very technical accounting area, and the answer will change not just for each particular company, but for each particular director given his or her personal financial circumstances. So a really good idea to get independent financial advice from a properly qualified tax advisor. Next question.
All right, so who should pay for the board director liability insurance, the board director or the company?
Now, first of all, the sad fact about directors and officers insurance is that it's never good enough. It never covers everything you want it to cover, and you can never afford the level of cover that you would like. Once you get past that and you say, okay, this is the level of cover that seems to be a reasonable cost value equation for us, the question of who pays, most organizations will ask the directors to make a personal contribution towards the cost of the cover. And that is because it prevents the insurer from getting off the hook by saying, but this isn't your policy, this is the company's policy. So you'll often see people Some directors will have their own and will arrange their own. Most directors will actually take the shelter under the company policy and will pay a contribution. Now, on some boards, that contribution can be as low as $10 a year. On other boards, it can be as high as several $1,000s a year. And it really does depend on the cover. Directors and officers insurance is very fraught. You need to understand it's a very good idea when you have a board to bring in your broker and talk through what your insurance does and doesn't cover, and what insurance similar companies have and how that differs to yours and why. Really understand the decisions you're making, because they could be the difference between liberty and poverty, and freedom or incarceration. So think carefully about insurance.
A question from Andrew Bird. Do you see more younger people being appointed to boards happening more broadly?
That's a very good question, Andrew. And just last night, I was talking to a board of young people who are on a not-for-profit, which is focused on young people in a particular industry sector. So yes, I do see people at a younger age getting appointed to boards. Obviously, the whole of Australia is very excited about Bridget Loudon getting invited and indeed accepting the invitation to join the board of Telstra. She will have brought the average age of the directors down. But it's important to understand that whilst you can technically be a director at the age of 18, being on a board requires a certain level of maturity. It requires a certain level of ability to collaborate and cooperate with your board colleagues. It requires a certain level of ability to refrain from rapid action and take careful and considered action. And generally, people want to offer board positions, as I suggested at the beginning of this presentation, to people who've already demonstrated their capacity to have good, solid, sound judgment in similar circumstances to the ones that you expect the company. So it's really kind of hard to look at somebody who's just turned 18 and say, yep, this person meets all of those criteria. By the time you start getting into your early 30s, you're still considered very, very young for a board, but you've also had the ability to demonstrate some track record of success, and particularly some acquisition of decision-making and technical skills that would be valuable to a board. So a lot depends on how you define young, but yes, boards, particularly those that are excited about technology, are generally trending to get younger and trending to get more female.
All right, we do have a lot of questions coming in. So how many directorships are too many? If one of my directors has over 10 boards, both NFP and for-profit, is it too many?
I would say 10 boards, yes. Does your director wear blue stockings with red underpants over the top? Because that is really quite a superhuman effort. To be across all of the issues for all of those companies. Maybe they can do it. I would be quite surprised, and I certainly can't do it. The most I can manage at any one time is 5. 6 is very uncomfortable, and I can only do it for a little while whilst I'm transitioning with my portfolio. So really important to think through and to be very explicit about, if you join my board, this is how many days per month I want you to dedicate to my business. This is how often we have our meetings. This is when I expect you to be there in person. This is when I will allow you to be there in Zoom or Blue Jeans or webinars or whatever other technology we might be using. But ideally at the outset as a director, you should not be joining a board if you think you're not going to be able to make it to attend, at least by technology, most of the meetings. It's just a very bad look to be on a board and not attending the meetings. When you're listed, you will have to tell people how many meetings each director was entitled to attend and how many they actually attended. And it's a good idea to keep a running tally even before you're listed so that you can nip any of those issues in the bud.
Amazing. Thank you, Julie. We just have time for 2 more questions. A director gets paid in some fashion, receives support from the company. Are they employees? If not, what are they?
Oh, this is a vexed one. Directors are not employees. Directors are directors. They, however, can receive their director fees in the normal paid superannuation on top of them. Other directors prefer to invoice for those fees. They might even use a company as a vehicle through which they invoice. However, using a company as a vehicle doesn't absolve you of your responsibilities and your duties and your personal liabilities. So if everything goes wrong, the law will just look straight through all of those structures and go for you as the physical person behind them. So it really is a question of what is most convenient. I've been on boards where some directors invoiced, some directors were paid on payroll. I've been on boards where everyone was on payroll. I've been on boards where everybody invoiced. Usually it's best if everybody does the same thing. And again, it's one of those conversations to have. Make sure as well that directors are paying the proper taxes. It's a very bad look if you're just about to IPO and you suddenly discover that half of your board has a tax issue. That can kind of slow down the process. Okay, technicalities again. An executive is someone who has the ability to make decisions within the powers that they've been given. A non-executive is someone who does not have that ability. So the board collectively is responsible for everything that happens because the law assumes that they've either done it, caused it to be done, or delegated the power and permitted it to be done. Now, if you've been given power to execute or implement something, you are an executive. If you have not, you're a non-executive, and the only power you have is when you come together as a board. A non-executive does not work for the company as a director. They are not an employee. An executive director, for example, a finance director or a technical director, does work for the company and is an employee, but can only have executive power in the area of their specific delegations of authority. An independent director, as well as not being an executive, because an executive by definition can't be independent, but an independent director cannot be executive, shareholder, major trading partner, or a relative of any of those, or have been one of those during the last 2 to 3 years. So really important, independence really is quite removed from the company and able therefore to dispassionately evaluate the decisions they're making without any form of skin in the game whatsoever. Independence is a high bar. Okay, I think that's all we had time for. I'm getting the old throat cutting, so but in a very nice way. It's been lovely to talk to you. As I said, I know it is almost impossible to answer all of your questions. I do thank you for giving them because it shows that you're interested, and there's nothing scarier than standing here looking down the barrel of the camera and thinking, I wonder if they're asleep or if they've gone for coffee. And I see the questions come in and I go, oh, thank goodness, yes, they're alive and alert and they're enjoying, I hope. If you have questions that weren't answered, please feel free to contact me. My details are there. I'll be delighted to help. Otherwise, you can always reach me through the team at Stone and Chalk.